Mark had been gone for exactly 5 days. 5 days of site inspections in another state, of hotel breakfasts eaten alone, of long phone calls with contractors about load-bearing walls and drainage coefficients. He was a structural engineer by trade, the kind of man who noticed when things were out of place, who trusted measurements over assumptions and documentation over handshakes. So when he pulled his truck into the driveway of the house he'd owned for 2 years, the modest two-story on Elm Crest Drive with the big backyard and the cedar privacy fence he'd installed himself and walked around to the rear of the property to check his garden, he stopped dead. There, built directly into the fence he had paid for and anchored himself, was a brand new wooden gate, freshly stained, perfectly fitted, hinged, and opening, without any hesitation, directly onto his neighbor's yard. Mark stood very still for a long moment. He was not a man who panicked easily. He set down the bag he was carrying, crouched beside the gate, and examined the hardware. New screws, new hinges. The wood was pale and clean, not yet weathered, still faintly smelling of stain. Someone had done this while he was away. Someone had cut an opening in his fence, framed it, hung a gate, and done it so neatly that it might have looked, to an uninformed eye, like it had always been there. Mark stood back up. He looked at the gate. He looked at the yard on the other side, Karen's yard, immaculate as always, with its trimmed hedges and potted topiaries arranged along the patio like sentinels. He took out his phone and started taking photographs. That was the moment the trouble began, though in truth, the trouble had been building for a long time. Elm Crest Drive was the kind of street that photographed well: wide sidewalks, mature trees, houses with decent setbacks and tidy landscaping. The homeowners association kept things orderly, some would say aggressively so. Trash bins had to be out of sight by 7 in the evening. Holiday decorations were permitted only within specified date windows. Paint colors required pre-approval from a committee. Most residents had made their peace with these arrangements. A few genuinely enjoyed them. And then there was Karen. Karen Whitfield had been the HOA president for 6 years running, which was either a testament to her dedication or a reflection of the fact that nobody else wanted the job, depending on whom you asked. She was in her late 50s, always put together, always in pressed linen or structured blazers regardless of the weather, and she had a way of speaking that implied every statement she made was already settled law. She did not ask, she announced. She did not suggest, she declared. Most of her neighbors had learned to nod and move on. Pushback only seemed to energize her. Mark had encountered Karen a handful of times in the 2 years since he'd moved in. She'd cited him once for a recycling bin left out a day too long. She'd sent him a letter about the color of his mulch. Apparently it fell outside the approved brown spectrum. He'd complied both times without argument, because the disputes weren't worth his energy, and because, as a structural engineer who worked with municipal regulations daily, he understood that rules had their place. But he also understood property lines. He understood deeds and plat maps, and the legal language of ownership. And looking at that gate, that uninvited, unasked-for gate built into his fence while he was 800 miles away, something shifted in him. Not rage. Not panic. Calculation. He went inside, set his bag down, made himself a cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop. He pulled up the county assessor's website and downloaded the plat map for his property. He measured. He cross-referenced. He made notes on a yellow legal pad in the precise, unhurried handwriting of someone who had spent a career producing documents that needed to withstand scrutiny. By the time he finished his coffee, he had confirmed what he'd already suspected. The fence and the gate someone had placed in it sat entirely within the boundaries of his property, not on a shared line, not in an easement. His. And nobody had asked him a single thing about it. Karen appeared the next morning at 8:15, dressed in a cream blouse and carrying a travel mug, moving across her patio with the unhurried confidence of someone who had no expectation of being questioned. She opened the gate, his gate, in his fence, and stepped through into his yard with the ease of a person walking through a door they had always owned. Mark was waiting. He had his coffee too. He'd been up early. He watched her stop when she saw him standing there in the yard, and he noted the brief flash of something not quite surprise, not quite guilt that crossed her face before she settled back into her usual expression of composed authority. "Mark," she said, as if she'd run into him at a neighborhood picnic. "Welcome back. How was your trip?" He told her it had been fine. Then he asked her, very calmly, who had built the gate in his fence. Karen smiled. Not a warm smile, more the smile of someone who had rehearsed this moment and felt confident in the script. She explained that the HOA had been discussing improved community access routes for some time. The gate, she said, was a convenience, a shortcut that would benefit multiple residents by connecting the rear portion of Elm Crest Drive to the park 2 blocks north. Going through his property shaved several minutes off the walk. She had arranged for the work to be done while he was away to minimize any disruption to his schedule. She presented this as a thoughtfulness. Mark asked her which HOA resolution authorized the construction. She said the board had discussed it. He asked for the document number. She said it had been an informal agreement. He asked for the names of the board members who had voted. She said the details were in the minutes. He asked when those minutes would be available to review. Her smile tightened, just slightly. She said she could have someone send them over. He said he'd appreciate that. Then he told her, still calmly, that until he had reviewed the documentation authorizing the gate, he would appreciate it if no one used it. Karen looked at him for a moment, the look of someone recalibrating, and said that the gate was a community amenity and residents were already aware of it. Mark said he understood. He would still need to see the documentation. She left the way she had come, back through the gate, back into her yard, the gate swinging shut behind her with a soft wooden clack. The documentation never came. 3 days passed. Mark sent a written request to the HOA email address. He received an auto-response. He sent a follow-up. He received nothing. In that time, he counted 11 separate occasions when someone walked through the gate and his fence. A woman with a golden retriever. A man in running clothes. 2 children chasing each other. An older couple walking hand in hand who looked genuinely surprised when Mark appeared on his own back porch and asked politely if they knew this was private property. They said they'd been told the path was open. They were very apologetic. He told them it was not their fault. He took photographs of each incident, time-stamped, and added them to a folder he had labeled with the date he'd returned home and found the gate. He called the county building department. He confirmed that no permit had been pulled for the gate construction. He called a property attorney named David Reeves, a man he'd worked with once on a boundary dispute at a job site, and explained the situation in precise detail. David listened without interrupting. When Mark finished, David said, "If that fence is entirely on your land, and it sounds like it is, you have the right to block that passage however you see fit, as long as your method complies with local code. Get your permits, do it right, and you'll be on solid ground." Mark thanked him. He already knew what he was going to do. He just needed to know he was allowed to. It was his next-door neighbor on the other side, a retired postal worker named Gerald, who first told Mark the full story. Gerald was in his 70s, with a careful, deliberate manner, and the kind of institutional memory that comes from watching a neighborhood change over many decades. He was not a man who gossiped. He simply observed, filed things away, and occasionally decided the time had come to share what he knew. He waited until Karen's car had left the driveway one afternoon, then walked over to the low fence separating his property from Mark's, and beckoned him over with a small wave. He poured 2 glasses of lemonade from a pitcher he'd brought with him, handed one across the fence, and leaned against the post with the practiced ease of a man who had spent a great deal of his life leaning on things and thinking before he spoke. He spoke quietly, not from fear exactly, but from the habit of discretion that comes from spending decades delivering other people's mail and learning which conversations stay in which households. Gerald had lived on Elmcrest Drive for 23 years. He remembered the family that had owned Mark's house before him, a couple named the Hendersons, who'd been there for 8 years before selling. Richard and Diane Henderson, Gerald said, a quiet pair, kept their yard tidy, brought cookies to the block party every summer. Karen had approached them probably 4 or 5 years back with a proposal for a cut-through path across the rear of their yard. She'd framed it as a community benefit, just as she'd apparently framed it to Mark, using phrases like neighborhood connectivity and walkability enhancement that sounded like language borrowed from a city planning report. The Hendersons had listened politely and declined. Karen came back a second time with what Gerald described as a more forceful set of arguments. She'd suggested the HOA had some authority to designate pedestrian easements on private property under certain circumstances, a claim she delivered with enough confidence that Richard Henderson had apparently spent 2 evenings trying to find the provision in the HOA governing documents, before concluding it didn't exist. They consulted their own attorney, who confirmed that it did not exist and had never existed. The proposal had died, officially, but Karen had not forgotten it, and she had not forgiven the Hendersons for refusing her. And by the time they sold the house and moved, the relationship between their household and hers had grown distinctly cold. The reason Karen wanted that path, Gerald explained, was practical in a way that had nothing to do with community benefit and everything to do with personal convenience. Karen's property sat at an angle on the block that made walking to Riverside Park, where she took her 2 dogs every morning without exception, rain or shine, a longer route than it was for most of her neighbors. Going around the block the standard way took 12 minutes on foot. The shortcut through Mark's yard would have cut that to roughly 5 or 6. Over the course of a year of daily walks, that was nearly 40 hours of difference. She had also, over the years, begun holding informal HOA business meetings with a small group of favored neighbors at the park's pavilion on Sunday mornings. 2 meetings that the broader membership was not always informed about and that were not reflected in. The formal minutes and the walk she found inconvenient was one she made with increasing regularity. The gate wasn't a community amenity. It was a personal convenience dressed up in the language of community governance, and the dressing had been so consistently applied, for so long, that Karen had perhaps begun to believe in it herself. Mark absorbed this without comment, occasionally sipping his lemonade. When Gerald finished, Mark asked him one question. Had anyone else on the street ever pushed back on Karen about anything like this? Gerald thought about it for a moment. He said a few people had raised concerns over the years about the fine assessments, about decisions that seemed to benefit certain properties more than others, about the opacity of the financial records. Most had been met with a combination of procedural complexity and social pressure, the subtle implication that raising objections made you a bad neighbor, someone who didn't care about the community, someone who was making everyone's lives harder for no good reason. It was effective, Gerald said, because most people didn't have the time or the documentation to see it through. Mark thanked him, finished his lemonade, and handed the glass back over the fence. Gerald told him he was glad someone was finally doing something and went back to his garden. Mark went inside and opened his laptop. He pulled up the county's Geographic Information System portal and navigated to his property's official plat. He printed it. He compared it against the measurements he'd taken from his own yard the day he'd returned and found the gate, checking the position of the fence post by post against the recorded boundary coordinates. He made a scaled drawing on graph paper, an old habit from his early days in the field, before everything moved to software, the kind of tactile work that helped him think and marked the precise location of the gate relative to the surveyed boundary lines. The fence was not on the line. It was not near the line. It sat approximately 4 feet inside his property on every side, fully contained within his ownership, with no shared boundary, no line straddling, no ambiguity. Karen had no legal claim to any part of it. No easement had ever been granted, recorded, or even formally requested through the proper county channels. She had simply waited for a new owner, one she assumed would not know to check, and had moved while he was out of town. He updated the folder on his desktop photographs, plat maps, the scaled drawing, the building permit absence confirmation from the county, the written requests he'd sent to the HOA, and the absence of any response. He added a detailed note about his conversation with Gerald, dated and time-stamped it, and saved the document. He made a backup copy. Then he opened a new browser tab and began looking up local fencing contractors who did commercial-grade steel panel installation, reading through their project portfolios with the careful attention of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. The gate continued to be used every day. Mark documented everything. He kept the footage from his 2 rear yard cameras, organized by date and time, backed up to a cloud drive, with a second local copy on an external hard drive that he kept in a fireproof box in his office. He was methodical in a way that had nothing theatrical about it. No dramatics, no confrontations, no lengthy speeches to the people he found walking through his yard. He simply recorded. He noted. He prepared. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to interpret his continued quiet as acceptance. At a chance encounter near the mailboxes one evening, she mentioned offhandedly that several residents had told her how much they appreciated the new shortcut. She said this with the satisfied tone of someone reporting on a successful project. Mark said he was still waiting for the HOA documentation. She said she'd look into it. He said he'd appreciate that. She asked if he might consider formalizing the arrangement with a neighborly agreement rather than paperwork. He said he preferred paperwork. She gave him the patient smile of someone who believed paperwork was a formality that would eventually become unnecessary. He gave her nothing in return but a polite nod. 2 days later, he watched from his kitchen window as a woman he didn't recognize walked through the gate and set up a folding lawn chair in the back corner of his yard to sit in the afternoon shade while her toddler played in the grass. He went outside. He introduced himself. The woman, genuinely startled, said she'd understood that the back path area was common space. Mark explained, very gently, that it was not. She apologized profusely and left immediately. He didn't blame her. She'd been told something false by someone she had no reason to distrust. He called David Reeves again that evening. David told him that what he'd described ongoing use of private property based on a misrepresentation of its status was the kind of thing that, if left unchallenged, could form the basis of a prescriptive easement claim over time in some jurisdictions, though the timeline for that was long and the bar was high. More immediately, David said, Mark had the right to terminate the unauthorized access, his property, his decision, his timeline. He recommended Mark do it in a way that was documented, permitted, and defensible. Mark said he intended to. He'd already submitted the permit application 3 days earlier. He was just waiting for approval. The permit came through on a Thursday afternoon, delivered to his email at 3:47. Mark printed it, added it to the folder, and called the contractor a company called Ironclad Structures that he'd worked with twice on commercial projects, once for a warehouse perimeter in the industrial district, and once for a security enclosure at a utility substation. He trusted their work. He knew their crew chief, a methodical man named Dave, who communicated in precise sentences and had never on any job Mark had overseen failed to meet a measurement. He told Dave exactly what he needed, gave him the setback measurements confirmed by the permit, and scheduled everything for the following Tuesday evening, starting at 7. He arranged it so quietly, no announcements, no conversations with neighbors about what was coming, that not a single person on Elmcrest Drive had any idea it was happening until the truck was already on the street. The truck arrived at 6:58. It was not a subtle truck, it was a flatbed loaded with heavy-gauge steel panels finished in powder-coated charcoal gray, steel posts of the kind used in commercial applications, bags of fast-setting concrete, and the full complement of hardware necessary to drive posts 2 feet into the ground and set them so they would hold against any pressure. Dave and his crew of 4 worked by the bright white light of portable work lamps, steady and unhurried, moving with the efficient rhythm of people who had done this many times before. They began at the north corner and worked south. Posts went in first, driven and set in concrete. Panels followed, bolted and secured. Mark stayed out of their way. He'd confirmed the layout before they started. He went inside, made dinner, washed the dishes, and read for an hour. He checked on the progress once, around 9:30, and found the posts already set and the first panels being bolted into place. Dave gave him a thumbs up. Mark went back inside. By 11:20, the work was complete. 214 linear feet of commercial-grade steel panel fencing, 2 meters in height, set inside the cedar fence line and running the full width of the rear yard without a gap or an opening anywhere along its length. Dave handed him the completion documentation measurements, materials list, installation photos for the contractor's own records. They shook hands. The crew loaded their equipment, backed the flatbed carefully out of the driveway, and drove away. Mark walked out to the backyard and stood for a moment in the dark, looking at what had been built. The cedar fence remained visible just behind the new structure, and Karen's gate still hung perfectly on its hinges. It simply no longer led anywhere. He went inside. He slept well. Karen discovered it at 7:12 the following morning. He knew the approximate time because his rear camera caught the moment she stepped out onto her patio in her morning clothes, coffee in hand, moving toward the gate with the automatic ease of someone performing a routine so established it required no conscious thought. She opened the cedar gate, which swung on its hinges without resistance, as it always had, and stopped. In front of her, at a distance of perhaps 18 inches, was a solid wall of powder-coated steel, stretching in both directions as far as she could see along the fence line. No gap, no door, no handle. Just steel, gray and immovable in the early morning light. She stood there for a long moment. She reached out and touched the surface of the nearest panel, as if verifying it was real. Then she walked along the length of the steel fence, looking for an opening that was not there. She walked back. She opened the cedar gate again, perhaps confirming it still functioned, and established that it functioned perfectly and opened onto a wall. She stood at the open gate for almost 2 full minutes, and then she went back inside her house, and the cedar gate swung shut behind her. 17 minutes later, she came back out with her phone pressed to her ear. She stood in the middle of her yard gesturing as she talked, pacing in a small rectangle across her patio. Mark, watching the footage later, noted that she changed direction 3 times during the call, the body language of someone cycling through arguments and finding each of them unsatisfying in turn. The first police officer arrived at 9:40. He was a young man, professional and unhurried, who walked around to the back of the property with Mark, looked at the fence, looked at the plat map Mark showed him, looked at the permit documentation, and asked a few questions in a methodical way. Karen was also present, standing at the boundary of her property, describing the fence as retaliatory, unauthorized, and a violation of community access rights. The officer listened to her fully. Then he turned to Mark and asked if the fence was on his property. Mark showed him the plat and the survey stakes. The officer examined the documentation for several minutes. He asked Mark if he'd pulled a permit. Mark showed him the permit, printed and in a clear sleeve in the folder he'd brought outside with him. The officer looked at Karen. He told her that based on what he could see, the fence appeared to be a legally permitted structure on private property. He said there was nothing he could do. Karen asked if he could compel Mark to remove it. The officer said he could not. She asked who she could call. He suggested the HOA or a civil attorney. He thanked them both for their time and left. Karen called the HOA's legal advisor that same morning. She called 2 board members. She called the county planning office. By afternoon, she had assembled a small audience of interested neighbors in her driveway, most of whom had come out because they'd noticed the police car earlier and were curious rather than because they were there to support her. Mark watched from inside, not hiding, not performing, just occupying his own house on his own property. He had anticipated this. He had prepared for it. He had learned, in 2 decades of structural engineering work, that when you build something correctly, when the plans are right, the permits are in order, and the workmanship is solid, what other people say about it changes nothing. The county planning office called him back that afternoon. He explained the situation. The planner on the line reviewed the permit on file and confirmed that everything appeared to be in order. She said someone might be sent out to verify the setback measurements. He said he welcomed that. Nobody came. The measurements were not a question. He'd done them 3 times. Mark continued to investigate. He had the kind of orderly, methodical curiosity that made him good at his job, the instinct to follow the document trail, to check what was recorded against what was claimed, to look at the numbers and let them tell their own story. Over the following 2 weeks, he filed a formal public records request with the HOA for all meeting minutes from the past 3 years, all financial records for the same period, and all contracts executed on behalf of the association. The HOA had bylaws that required these records to be produced within 14 days of a written request from a member. Mark was a member. He had paid his dues every year since buying the house. What came back was incomplete. Karen had apparently compiled the response herself, and several line items in the financial statements were vague in ways that a trained eye would notice. Mark noticed. He cross-referenced the incomplete records against each other, looking for inconsistencies. He found them. He found a landscaping contract for the HOA common areas totaling $4,800, executed with a company called Summit Green Services, with no record of competitive bidding, as required by the HOA's own governing documents. He found a $400 line item for administrative supplies that appeared in 6 consecutive monthly statements without any accompanying receipts or itemization. He found a record of fence repairs performed on a common boundary, a fence that, when he checked, bordered Karen's property and only Karen's property and didn't appear on any map of HOA common areas. He gathered this information the same way he gathered everything else systematically, without rushing, without jumping to conclusions. He made a spreadsheet. He labeled each discrepancy with the supporting documents. He did not yet know what he was going to do with it, but he understood that documentation was like load-bearing structure. You built it carefully and it held weight you didn't yet know you'd need to carry. It was Gerald who first mentioned that another former HOA board member, a woman named Patricia who had served 2 terms before resigning, had left the neighborhood partly because of conflicts with Karen over exactly this kind of thing. Mark asked Gerald if he knew where Patricia was now. Gerald said she still lived about 2 miles away, in a condo she'd bought after selling her house on Elmcrest. Mark looked up her number through the county voter registration database. It was a matter of public record and called her. She answered on the 3rd ring. When he explained who he was and why he was calling, there was a long pause on her end. Then she said, "I've been waiting for someone to call me about this for 3 years." They talked for over an hour. When he hung up, he had a new folder on his desktop, labeled with her name, containing the summary of what she'd told him. She had documents of her own. She agreed to provide copies. The HOA held its quarterly meeting on the 3rd Thursday of the month, at 7 in the evening, in the community room of the local library. Mark requested time on the agenda. Any member had the right to do so under the governing documents, and Karen, as president, was obligated to grant it. He arrived 12 minutes early, chose a seat where he'd have a clear sightline to the projection screen he'd arranged with the librarian, and set up his laptop. He'd tested the connection the day before. He'd printed backup copies of every document he intended to present, organized in labeled manila folders, enough for the board members and a few extras. He was not expecting things to go a particular way. He had simply prepared for every way they might go. The room was fuller than usual. He had said nothing to any of his neighbors about what he was planning to present. But word had circulated, the way word always does in small neighborhoods, that something was happening at the meeting, that Mark from the house with the new steel fence had requested agenda time, and that Karen had been seen, in the days since, making a number of phone calls from her driveway. 43 residents attended, which Gerald told him afterward was the highest turnout the quarterly meeting had seen in at least 8 years. Some people brought their spouses. A few brought lawn chairs, having apparently anticipated that the community room seating might not be adequate. It was. Karen opened the meeting in her customary fashion: crisp, organized, efficient. An agenda review, an approval of the prior meeting's minutes, a brief update on the sidewalk repair schedule for the northern end of the street, a reminder about the upcoming window for holiday decoration approvals. She moved through each item with the practiced ease of someone who had run this meeting many times, and she did it without looking at Mark more than once. He sat in the third row, his folder on his lap, waiting. When the member forum portion of the meeting opened, Mark stood. He introduced himself by name and address formally, for the record. He thanked the board for the time. Then he began. He described the gate that had been installed in his fence without his knowledge, consent, or any formal HOA authorization, walking through the timeline precisely. When he'd left for his trip, when the gate appeared, when Karen had appeared to explain it, what she had claimed in that conversation, and what the documentation had or had not supported. He showed the photographs projected onto the wall via his laptop of the gate's construction, of the 11 instances of unauthorized passage he'd documented in the first week alone, of the woman with the folding chair, of the children playing in the back corner of his yard, of Karen herself, walking through the gate on the morning footage that showed her moving with the assurance of someone who had never considered that she might not have the right. He showed the plat map. He showed the permit for his steel fence. He showed the documented absence of any building permit for the original gate. He showed the HOA records he'd received in response to his formal request, with the discrepancies he'd found highlighted in yellow, and he named each discrepancy, specifically the landscaping contract, the administrative supply charges, the fence repair that bordered only Karen's property. He spoke for 12 minutes without notes, because he knew the material, and he spoke in the same measured, precise way he spoke when presenting structural findings to a client, without drama, without editorializing, simply laying the evidence in sequence and letting it accumulate into a weight that the room could feel. When he finished and sat down, there was a moment of complete quiet. Not the silence of indifference, the silence of a room absorbing something it had been given time to feel the full mass of. Then Patricia, whom he had not told anyone was coming, whom Karen certainly had not expected, stood up from the back of the room. She was a compact woman in her early 60s, with the composed, slightly formal manner of someone accustomed to being underestimated. She introduced herself, gave her former board position and dates of service, and said she had left because she had found it impossible to perform her duties accurately, while certain procedural and financial decisions were being made unilaterally by the board president without proper authorization. She said she had documentation. She had printed copies, because she was also a thorough person. She began distributing them to the people sitting around her, who passed them along the rows with the quiet efficiency of a congregation sharing a hymnal. After that, the meeting did not really resemble a meeting anymore. A man named Tom, who owned the corner house and had a direct, blunt manner and no apparent patience for social niceties, stood up and said that 3 years ago, Karen had sent him a cease and desist letter on HOA letterhead about a shed he was building, citing a rule that he'd later discovered didn't exist anywhere in the governing documents. He'd backed down at the time because he hadn't known how to verify it and because the letter had looked official. He'd thought about it many times since. A woman named Sandra said she'd been assessed a fine for a fence paint color that turned out, when she'd checked the approved palette 3 years after the fact, to be within the allowed range. She held up the paint chip, still attached to a printed page, as though she'd been carrying it around in anticipation of this moment. Several others spoke. Each account was specific. Each was a single incident on its own, easily dismissible in isolation. Together, arranged in sequence, and in the presence of the financial documentation that Mark and Patricia had provided, they were something different. They were a pattern visible to everyone in the room. Karen attempted, at several points, to regain the floor. She questioned Mark's motives, suggesting, without quite saying it directly, that his fence was retaliatory and that his records request had been designed to harass. She said the financial records were being presented selectively and out of context, and that the full picture would show everything was properly managed. She said that Patricia's resignation had been under circumstances that called her objectivity into question. She was not wrong to try these defenses. They were the available defenses. But each time she deployed one, the room's response was measured against the specific documents on the table, and the documents held their ground in a way that speeches could not match. By 8:45, when the board member sitting to her left, a quiet man named James, who had served 2 terms and was generally regarded as honest, quietly suggested that the association might want to consider an emergency vote on interim governance procedures, Karen said nothing. She looked at the table in front of her. The vote passed 7-2, with Karen and 1 ally dissenting. A special election was held 3 weeks later. The HOA governing documents allowed for a recall election by petition, and the petition had gathered enough signatures, more than enough, as it turned out within the first 4 days. Residents who had never attended a quarterly meeting in years drove by to sign it. Karen did not contest the recall. A new interim president was elected, a retired accountant named Robert who had lived on Elmcrest Drive for 11 years, served briefly on the budget subcommittee several years back, and had a reputation for being scrupulously fair and nearly incapable of cutting corners in any context. He was methodical in the way that made some people find him slightly dull, and made others, including Mark, who recognized the type, immediately deeply reassured. He was exactly the right person for what came next. The HOA's legal advisor conducted a thorough review of the financial records, the complete records, not the partial version Karen had assembled for Mark's public records request, which the advisor described in her written summary as selectively compiled. The discrepancies Mark had identified were confirmed. There were others. The total amount in question was not enormous in absolute terms, spread across 3 years of improperly documented invoices and contracts executed without proper authorization, but the pattern was consistent and documentation was clear. Karen received a formal letter from the HOA's attorney within 2 weeks of the election. She retained her own attorney. Negotiations began. Mark was not directly a party to those negotiations, but Robert, who believed transparency was the appropriate way to conduct the association's business, kept him informed in general terms as things progressed. The outcome of those negotiations, when it concluded approximately 6 weeks after the recall election, included Karen's agreement to reimburse the association for the gate construction costs which had been paid, without authorization, from HOA operating funds, and to bear the cost of removing the cedar gate from Mark's fence and restoring the fence panel to its original condition. She also agreed to a financial settlement covering the identified irregularities, the terms of which were confidential. Robert described it to Mark simply as appropriate. Karen did not attend the next quarterly meeting. She sent a 3-sentence written statement that the secretary read aloud, which expressed appreciation for her years of service and wished the association well. Nobody commented on it. The gate came out on a Saturday morning. The same contractor Karen had originally hired to install it sent 2 men with the right tools, and they had it done in under 3 hours. Mark was home but stayed inside until the work was finished. He walked out afterward and examined the fence panel that had been installed in the gate's place, cedar, matching stain, same rail spacing. It looked exactly as it had before he'd left on his trip, clean and uninterrupted. The fence ran the full length of the property, and beyond it, his yard was quiet. The steel fence remained. There had been some early discussion, at the first meeting after Karen's removal, about whether it should come down now that the underlying dispute was resolved. Robert had asked Mark what he wanted to do. Mark said he'd think about it. He thought about it for about 3 days, weighing the optics against the practicality, the neighborly gesture against the simple fact that he'd built a good fence on his own property for his own reasons, and decided the fence was staying. He'd permitted it correctly. He'd built it on his land. It wasn't hurting anyone. And it was, he had to admit, a structurally excellent fence. He had standards. The HOA, under Robert's steady hand, spent the following months doing something the association hadn't done in years. Going back to the governing documents from the beginning and reviewing every rule, every procedure, every financial protocol against the simple standard of whether it was actually being followed and whether it was actually fair. The process was not exciting. It involved a lot of Tuesday evenings in the library community room and a lot of reading. Some rules were clarified to remove the ambiguity that had allowed them to be applied selectively. One provision was removed entirely, an exterior lighting rule that had turned out to be internally inconsistent and had apparently been used as the basis for 2 fines that were now reversed. A financial oversight committee was established, with 3 members elected by the full association rather than appointed by the president, and a requirement for an independent annual audit was added to the bylaws. Every proposed physical change to common areas now required a full board vote with written notice to affected property owners at least 30 days in advance. None of this was extraordinary. Most of it was simply the basic governance the association should have had all along. But it had taken the specific sequence of events, the gate, the fence, the meeting, the recall to create the conditions in which residents were willing to sit down and do the unglamorous work of fixing it. Gerald, who had planted a row of sunflowers along the fence between his yard and Mark's sometime in early summer, came over one evening while Mark was watering his tomatoes and leaned on the fence post in his familiar way. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know, most people would have just complained about it to their friends and done nothing, or they would have moved." Mark said he'd considered both. Gerald laughed quietly, the short, genuine laugh of a man who had watched enough of the world to find it genuinely funny. He said he was glad Mark hadn't done either. He went back to his sunflowers. The summer moved on with the unhurried rhythm of a street where nothing dramatic was happening, which was the kind of summer Mark had moved to Elm Crest Drive to have. A new family moved in 3 houses down and brought a large mixed-breed dog that barked at everything for the first 2 weeks before settling into a calmer existence. Tom finished his shed, the one Karen had sent him the fabricated cease-and-desist letter about, and it turned out to be a handsome building, properly constructed and painted a thoughtful shade of gray that complemented his house exactly. Sandra planted a vegetable garden in a raised bed along her front walkway, which under the old interpretation of the landscaping rules would have required approval from a committee that Karen had effectively controlled. Under the revised rules, it was simply permitted, provided it was maintained. She maintained it beautifully. She brought Mark a bag of cherry tomatoes in August, which he accepted and ate standing in his kitchen over the sink, the way you eat tomatoes when they're very good and there's no particular reason to be formal about it. Mark took on a demanding new project at work, a mixed-use development on the eastern side of the city, with interesting structural challenges in the foundation design, and it occupied much of his professional energy through the end of the year. He worked from home on Tuesdays and Fridays, and on those days he often ate lunch at the small table he'd set up under the oak tree in the backyard, in the shade, with whatever he'd made that morning and something to read. The yard was quiet in the way he'd always wanted it to be when he bought the house. The steel fence stood at the back of the property, solid and undemonstrative, and alongside it the cedar fence ran true, and together they enclosed the yard in a way that felt certain and complete. He did not think about Karen often. He had no particular feeling about her beyond a kind of neutral acknowledgement that she had existed and had made choices with consequences. He'd heard from Robert, indirectly, that she was considering selling the house. He had no strong feeling about that either. Whatever she decided was her business. He had never wanted a conflict with her. He had wanted his property left as he'd left it. What he did think about, on occasion, was the specific quality of that first moment coming home after 5 days, rounding the corner of the house and seeing the gate, the stillness of that moment, the deliberate way he'd crouched down to examine the hinges, the smell of the stain, the way he'd taken photographs before he'd said a single word to anyone. That had been the right move. Not because it was strategic, though it had turned out to be, but because it was honest. He'd wanted to understand what he was looking at before he responded to it. He'd wanted to know what was true before he decided what to do about it. That patience, that refusal to react from confusion rather than from knowledge, had been the thing that made everything else possible. The fence, the permits, the meeting, the documentation, all of it had followed from that single choice to stop, to look, to confirm, before acting. The last evening of October was clear and cold, and Mark sat in the backyard after dinner with a mug of coffee, wrapped in a heavy jacket, watching the sky go dark above the fence line. The oak tree had dropped most of its leaves by then, and they lay in a thick copper carpet across the grass, damp from the afternoon's rain. The light from the kitchen fell in a warm rectangle across the yard. The steel fence stood at the far edge of the property, dark and still, and behind it, the cedar fence ran in quiet parallel. A light was on in Karen's house. Nothing moved. He didn't need to think about what the fence meant beyond what it was. A structure, correctly built, on land he owned, protecting a boundary that was his to protect. Property lines were not abstractions. They were measurements, recorded in documents, verifiable with the right tools and the right knowledge. They didn't shift because someone was confident or well-connected or had held a community office for 6 years running. They didn't bend to accommodate convenience. They didn't disappear while you were 800 miles away on a job site. They were exactly where they were, and they stayed there, and anyone who built something in defiance of them was ultimately building on sand, no matter how well-dressed they were when they delivered the explanation. Gerald had said, at one point during all of it, that Mark hadn't just protected his yard, he'd protected the neighborhood. Mark had appreciated the sentiment without being entirely sure it was true. He'd set out to fix a specific problem on his specific property, and the rest had followed from the facts the way consequences tend to when the facts are solid. But perhaps that was how it worked more often than people thought. Perhaps protecting the one thing you were certain about, the thing you'd checked and measured and confirmed and could stand behind without hedging, was how larger things got protected. Not through campaigns or dramatic gestures, but through the steady, unglamorous refusal to let someone else's confidence substitute for truth. You checked, you documented. You acted from what you knew rather than from what you feared. Everything else followed from that. He finished his coffee. He set the mug down on the small table beside him. Above the fence lines, the stars had become visible in the October sky, faint at first, and then with increasing certainty as the last daylight faded out of the west. The fence stood solid at the edge of his property, where he'd put it and where it would stay. He sat with the quiet for a while longer, not thinking about anything in particular, just occupying the yard that was his, in the evening that was his, on the street where things had been set right, and where the ordinary life he'd wanted when he bought the house had, at some point in the last several months, quietly returned. Then he went inside, locked the back door behind him, and turned off the kitchen light. The yard went dark. The fence remained. A boundary is not defended only by what you build along its edge. It is defended by the knowledge of exactly where it runs, confirmed, measured, documented, and by the willingness to act from that knowledge clearly and without apology against any claim made in opposition to it, regardless of how confidently that claim is delivered. Mark had possessed all three. The fence was simply the visible evidence of that fact, standing in the dark at the back of a quiet yard on Elm Crest Drive, exactly where it belonged.